makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
A recent study has been published which attempts to quantify the scale of anti-Semitism across the ideological spectrum and also across different age groups. This is very interesting because anti-Semitism is part of the current discourse around racism and the culture war, and we often don't have enough quantitative data to back up certain positions. So the fact that this study now attempts to quantify the difference between both the left and right, the scale of anti-Semitism across both ideologies, is very important. This study is, the name of the study is Antisemitic Attitudes Across the Ideological Spectrum, written by Eitan Hirsch and Laura Royden. I'm going to read the abstract. It says, concern about anti-Semitism in the US has grown following recent rises in deadly assaults, vandalism, and harassment. Public accounts of anti-Semitism have focused on both the ideological left and right. However, there is little quantitative research evaluating left-wing versus right-wing anti-Semitism. Building on theories of social identity, racial competition, and effective partisanship, we examine anti-Semitic attitudes across the ideological spectrum and across demographic cohorts. We conduct several experiments in an original survey of 3,500 US adults, including a large oversample of adults ages 18 to 30. We find evidence of prejudice on the ideological left and among racial minority groups, but the data clearly show the epicenter of anti-Semitic attitudes is young adults on the far right. Unlike social identities that are closely aligned with ideology and partisanship, Jewish identity remains an outgroup to Americans across typical political divides, resulting in diverse forms of prejudice. So, we've heard a lot about anti-Semitism on the left, and clearly this study will show that it is an issue. But let's be honest, and we all know this, even the right-wingers who push the narrative that it's the left that's more anti-Semitic, that's not true. We've always known it's the right. So let's look at, before I go into some of the number crunching on the study itself, let's look at the Twitter thread that was made by one of the authors, Eitan Hirsch, summarizing some of the points in this study. So here's what's, so the key takeaway here is we often also have, I would say, a bias or a prejudice in assuming that older people tend to be more ideologically extremist. But in fact, what this study shows is that young people, especially young conservative people, tend to have considerably higher levels of anti-Semitism. So this is worrying because it means that people at a young age are being radicalized. And I'll explain how that radicalization works. But first, let's look at these charts. So they have various metrics on assessing anti-Semitism. So there's basically three measures. One is loyalty towards Israel. One is whether Jewish businesses should be boycotted, and the other is whether Jews have too much power in society. And this is the source of direct racism as well as conspiracy theories regarding Jews controlling finance, for example, things like that. So looking at the first chart, which is whether Jews are more loyal to Israel, say, than their own country, we see how this diverges completely. The green line is the young people, age 18 to 30. The rest is a cohort that's over 31. So we see both noticeable trends towards the conservative side, but the slope is clearly much higher among young people. And this is even more extreme when we look at the metric of too much power, where they're largely the same. And if age was not a factor, we would expect these lines to be pretty much overlapping. But here we see a massive, massive divergence the more we move towards the conservative side. So that is pretty stunning. Now, this one's also very interesting. In what domains do Jews have too much power? Now, it is often the case, and at least this is what I sense from big parts of the left, is that anti-Semitism arises due to the inability of a lot of people from separating legitimate criticism of Israel and genuine empathy for and solidarity for example, Palestinians, with the idea that all Jews are necessarily complicit in whatever bad foreign policy that or human rights abuses that Israel does commit. Here we see that, in fact, we see the Israel-Palestine domain as quite important, but there's only very few people who only reflect these anti-Semitic attitudes on the basis of the Israel-Palestine issue. So we can see that anti-Semitism works on many dimensions. It's not just, people who probably think Jews have too much power in the media may also think that they have too much power in banking, etc. And those who only see the Israel-Palestine issue as a source of anti-Semitism is actually quite small. Now, here's one that's also very interesting. This is on the double standard. So they asked the question whether U.S. Jews should denounce Israel whenever Israel does something bad, and whether U.S. Muslims should denounce Muslim countries when they do something bad. And there's clearly a double standard between both sides of the spectrum. So, as expected, the left is more demanding on Jews to condemn Israel for their actions as they would be for Muslims. Whereas conservatives, obviously, a much higher level, think that U.S. Muslims should denounce Muslim countries. Again, this is all reflective of a double standard. In fact, neither Jews nor Muslims should be ever forced to denounce countries that they don't live in, that they are not citizens of, for their actions. That is absolutely ridiculous, because we don't apply this standard to Christians. If a Christian country does something awful, if the Christian USA invades Iraq, that does not mean all Christians in the world must condemn what the US does. So there you have it. Now, let's go back to the study, because there's also some interesting charts and numbers at the very end. Here we go. So this is kind of a summary of the different dimensions where they're measuring anti-Semitism, and they're using now cohorts, college students versus non-students. And this is also quite stunning. So the more conservative you are, the more anti-Semitic you will be if you're a college student. If you see this, the line pretty much overlaps throughout the center and throughout the left. But as soon as you get to the conservative side, whoa, like that is a massive, massive difference. And this is really where you see the impact of the radicalization that certain organizations have undertaken. Organizations like Turning Points USA, Young America's Foundation, these are all far-right groups, PragerU, that even though they don't push an open anti-Semitic narrative, in fact, they're mostly very pro-Israel. But one of the great contradictions of the far right is this difficulty in weighing and balancing out the fact that they are being pushed towards defending Israeli foreign policy, because anything that Israel does against Palestinians will trigger the libs, with the fact that adopting far-right attitudes kind of eventually leads to anti-Semitism. So these groups, like I said, are not openly anti-Semitic, but they basically open the door to for the ideas that essentially enable college students to eventually become anti-Semitic. And the extreme example of this is activists, far-right, actual anti-Semitic activists like Nick Fuentes, whose supporters are known as Groypers, and who have actually had very public conflicts with the less extreme elements of the college far right, like Turning Points USA. So we know how this pathway exists because there's been studies about this. There was a very famous study that came out a couple of years ago that is called Auditing Radicalization Pathways on YouTube. And what they measured was the engagement from people on the basis of YouTube comments on the type of videos they would watch. And they concluded that people who began absorbing certain content, basically what one would call intellectual dark web, IDW type material. This is, like sort of the training wheels of the far right. People like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin. These people, once you engage with this content, what this study showed is that you would move on to more far right content. So you would move to actual alt-right channels and alt-right pundits. And eventually you would reach actual alt-right content, the actual racists, the people who are pushing for white ethno-states and things like that. And this is something that I think is obvious if you look at the fan base of these people. But it's good that there are studies now that actually demonstrably show these links. And this study, you can see here, the channels that they put under the IDW label, like I said, the Ben Shapiro, Brett Weinstein, Gatsa. These are like academics in many cases. These are respectable individuals, but they're pushing a narrative, the anti-SJW, the anti-woke crowd, the Western liberal civilization is under threat. And this leads you down a rabbit hole of even more extremist material. Then you move to the alt-right channels. These are the Paul Joseph Watsons, the Stefan Molyneux, the Steven Crowders of the world. And then eventually you end up in the formal alt-right. These are the actual racists. These are the people who, for example, were behind the Charlottesville riots. So that's the pathway. It's been demonstrated that it exists. Any right-winger who attempts to deny that this pathway isn't real, just show them this article, because they don't have many studies in their favor. But anyway, the final point I want to make is regarding the accusation that is very prominent among the right, that the left is more anti-Semitic. And let's be clear, left anti-Semitic is just as bad as right anti-Semitism. There's no question about it. We should have zero anti-Semitism, period. But if you followed British news, you will know that the Labour Party was embroiled in an anti-Semitism scandal previous to the 2019 election, and which many people think contributed significantly to Jeremy Corbyn losing that election. Now, the truth of the matter is Jeremy Corbyn definitely mishandled that crisis, and there definitely was, again, this sort of far left anti-Semitism was present in some quarters of Labour, particularly in the side that was most strongly in support of Corbyn. And the party didn't do enough about it. And they delayed taking action against it. Jeremy Corbyn visibly struggled during interviews when he was approached on this topic. So all of that is true. But what is also true is that the media overhyped this completely, because it completely overshadowed the reality of the Tory party being far more racist and far more prejudiced in every other way than Labour was. That is a fact. In fact, right now, the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has a history of incredibly racist comments when he was editor of numerous newspapers and magazines. So, weighing, on balance, who is the most racist, I think really you would struggle to deny that it's been the Tories who are much more racist. But again, the media and the political environment made this an issue that Labour was sadly too incompetent to handle, but they should have. So to back this up and to show some more statistical evidence to the point that anti-Semitism is more prevalent on the right, I present to you, there's an annual report by an organization called the CST. This is the Community Security Trust. It's a Jewish community site in Britain. And they basically produce a report every year that lists the number of anti-Semitic incidents that they've recorded in Britain, sort of the type of incident that it was, whether it was an incident of violence or whether it was on Twitter or graffiti or some other things like that. And they in their report they often try and assess the nature of the incident and sort of the ideology behind the incident. And lo and behold, it turns out that most of these incidents are caused by the right. So this is the latest report. This is from 2020, and we have here a graphic of the incident motivation. 396 of those incidents mentioned Hitler, Nazis, or swastikas. Now, it is true that you can still be on the left and use Nazi symbology if you're going to make an anti-Semitic comment. So I don't think 100% of these incidents necessarily came from the right. But still, it is more likely that someone from the right used Nazi imagery. 175 was Labour Party related, so we can assume that most of these came from the left. 136 was anti-Zionist, and 264 were conspiracy theories about Jewish power. Now, these, let's just assume for the sake of argument that split halfway, left and right is guilty of spreading Jewish conspiracy theories. That's a fact. But we clearly see a huge difference in the motivation being from imagery that is of the far right rather than motivation that is clearly from the left. Now, still assessing the exact motivation or rather the ideology of the motivation, like I said, could be difficult. And they do mention this. They say that 155 instances in which far-right motivation was evidenced. In contrast, far-left discourse was used in 65 incidences. So that's significant. And I've gone back and I've looked at sort of previous reports, and in most years you see that same trend. I think the only year where you saw a definitive left-leaning incidents was 2019, which is precisely when the election took place and when much of the anti-Semitism scandal kind of exploded. So that's probably not surprising, but that was, I guess, an oddity of a year. So again, it is sad that anti-Semitic violence happens on both sides. It certainly shouldn't happen on the left. I think as a leftist, one is responsible for calling out any incidents of anti-Semitism that one sees, whether it's and there's no incidents where it's harmless. Someone who shares a meme that the Rothschilds control 80% of central banks, which I've seen people post, you have to call this out, because it's not only factually incorrect, but it is part of a broader conspiracy theory attached to racism against Jewish people. And that's really what separates anti-Semitism from other forms of racism. I often hear like, well, why do they get a special word for it? And that's because racism against Jewish people isn't just limited to feelings of superiority or prejudice. It is the fact that there is a conspiracy theory attached to it, and you will find that you won't find that with any other form of racism, and that's why it's special. And again, the proof that this is mostly from the right, let's just have one final look at the numbers of the original study. Here's a chart of the regression results. So for those who aren't familiar with regressions, positive numbers mean that there is a positive effect towards anti-Semitism, and here it's clearly measured in percentage. If you see a star next to the number, that means that the value is statistically significant. If it's 2 stars, it's with a p-value of less than 0.1, which is the most robust measure of statistical significance. Even 1 star is a p-value of less than 0.05, which is still pretty strong. So here we see progressives with statistically significant results that are negative. That is, being progressive is likely to decrease the odds that you have anti-Semitic values. And this was strong on all 3 measures, whether it's the loyalty to Israel, the boycott of Israeli or Jewish businesses, or power, Jews having too much power. So on all 3 dimensions, it was statistically robust. And in contrast with, we see the strongest positive result with the alt-right. And this is a huge number. This is 22%. And on both metrics of boycott and power. Curiously, we don't see a statistically significant result when it comes to loyalty, which goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that right-wingers really struggle with this sort of, well, I have to defend Israel, but at the same time, I hate Jews. And that's really an existential struggle for far-right people. So I'm not surprised that we have this very weak result for loyalty. Whereas for Christian conservatives, whose defense of Israel has a biblical component, it's not surprised that this is actually quite strong and robust. But the final thing I want to say is that there were 2 cohorts that were also statistically significant, and that was blacks and Latinos. And let's not ignore this fact. There is a huge amount of anti-Semitism in the black community and in the Latino community. And that is, well, pretty awful, because it comes from 2 groups that suffer prejudice and racism of their own, yet are also often complicit in sharing these same narratives that you see from the alt-right and from the far right in general. So I truly hope that the black and Latino communities, and I say this also as a Latin American, because I see a lot of anti-Semitism in news comments, in Latin American news sites, etc. Sadly, anti-Semitism is not limited to white people. It is a universal phenomenon. It needs to be eradicated. People need to be, especially, and I say this to people on my tribe, people on the left, you really, really, really need to do a better job, a lot of you, in separating what is legitimate criticism for Israel and assuming that all Jewish people are necessarily complicit in those actions, or that by the fact that they're Jewish support those actions. That is patently false. That is not true. And it needs to stop. But my final remark is, in this eternal debate that we see as part of the culture war on whether anti-Semitism is a more common phenomenon on the left or on the right, I think the statistics are very, very clear. Right-wingers are much more anti-Semitic than left-wingers. And until there are studies that prove otherwise, I think that's a final word on the matter.